Welcome back. For this module, we're diving into our boomer microgenerations. Now, first, a little bit about the boomer generation. Oftentimes, millennials are called the me generation, but did you know back in 1976, when boomers were in their youth, they were referred to as the me generation. Now, this generation was born between 1946 and 1964. They're often defined as the generation following the post-World War II boom, thus the name boomers, by a sense of revolution that themed their youth, that hippie movement that we know them by, and the 70s stagflation and national sort of chaos that brought them into their adulthood. The microgenerations we'll talk about here are the leading boomer and the neo-boomer. So let's kick off with the leading boomer. Each of the microgenerations is given a name based on the most popular baby name from the years that they were born, which for the leading boomer, aka James, is 1946 to 1954. Currently, they're between the ages of 64 to 72. There are 40 million of them in the US and 560 million of them globally. We'll also take a look at their formative years and hold that up against a level of happiness and prosperity that they experienced during that time. So for the leading boomer, they were born during that true post-World War II boom, which was not just a boom in the amount of children being born, it was also a boom in industry, which made for a childhood themed by prosperity. We move into their childhood further into adolescence, and we see this sort of rise of tension between them, the group that's prospering, and the other group that we're seeing in America, which isn't prospering as much. Of course, that creates a lot of tension and serves to disillusion that prosperity that they associated with their younger years. Now, into their early adulthood, we see that disillusionment turn into a sense of revolution, this social responsibility that drives what we know as the hippie movement. But of course, the hippie movement eventually ends with national strain, which is what themes their early adulthood. When we think about this generation, we often associate it with a really popular song that I'm sure you know, Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones. So Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones is a really great tell for what is at this generation's core. It was released in 1965, right in the thick of that hippie movement, and the lyrics are a call for change. They point to government media skepticism, and it's all about this sort of spirit of free-spiritedness and sexual freedom, themes that, of course, were important to this generation in their youth. One other thing that this song touches on is this sort of dichotomy between poverty and wealth that is core to this generation's identity. That theme is also seen in other art of the time, like a lot of Andy Warhol's work. One quote from Warhol says that America started the tradition where the richest buy the same things as the poorest. Very interesting stuff. Now, what's even more interesting is that you would assume the generation leading a revolution would be a part of that poorer group. But turns out that was not the case. Hippies were middle-class American children from the right side of the economy, and after regular educations, they could commute to fine jobs from the suburbs. At least according to the iconic profile of the hippie movement, the flowering of the hippies, in the Atlantic in 1967. Now, of course, a lot of former hippies wound up succeeding with the jobs that they decided to take on. But now, 10,000 boomers are reaching retiring age daily, which is good for this generation because it gives them an opportunity to reach their full potential and reconnect with those hippie ideals that they feel kind of bad for abandoning. The leading boomer today is all about fulfilling that sense of duty, experiencing new adventures the way that they did when they were younger, and reconnecting with those hippie ideals. This is why 35% of all charitable donations actually come from the boomer demographic. But at the same time, as I said, they were able to succeed after they left those hippie ideals behind, and now 40% of all discretionary spending in the US is at the hands of the boomer demographic. 40% of all discretionary spending. That's a lot. And so what they're looking for is the kind of thing that's outlined in integrated charity, an insight at Trend Hunter that looks at ways to combine living well with doing good. A great example of this can be seen with Me to We. Me to We is a program that typically services youth who are looking to both travel and do a little good in the places that they visit. But when they started getting more demand from an adult demographic, namely boomers, they opened up a program specifically for them. To review, the leading boomer is dutiful, adventurous, and idealistic. Now that takes us into our second boomer microgeneration, the neo-boomer. The neo-boomer is named Lisa. Born between 1955 to 1964, neo-boomers are between the ages of 54 to 63. There are 42 million of them in the US and 680 million globally. Now, if you were paying attention to the leading boomers' formative years, then you'll remember I mentioned that there was a group that was not experiencing as much prosperity as the leading boomer. That is the group that the neo-boomers belong to. Although they were a part of that residual baby boom, the most prosperous and interesting thing to happen in their childhood was the rise of color TV, which was great because it let them watch all the good things happening in the world, but it also made them subject to all the bad things happening in the world as well, making for a childhood that felt more like spectatorship. Now, adolescence for them was themed by a sense of chaos, the chaos that we saw in the early adulthood of the leading boomer demographic. And again, sort of like what we saw with the leading boomer, that chaos catapulted them into a sense of action, but it was a little bit more rebellious for this generation. Whereas leading boomers were talking about peace and love, the neo-boomer was talking about rebelling, acting, and leading the sort of activism that we associate with social good today. Now, moving into their adulthood, we saw once again this sort of sense of strain and chaos, but it was more about self-preservation, considering they were a more scrappy group than it was about a general sense of strain. For this generation, it's more of a reverse Cinderella story, in that the assumption was that they would be as prosperous as the leading boomer, but they weren't. What they got instead was trouble. Trouble that's really well summed up by the iconic Marvin Gaye song, What's Going On. Now, What's Going On is a great song for this generation because, once again, it was released in 1971 when they were just in the thick of their youth. It's themed by the sort of tensions we see at the time, which were largely racial. It followed the post-Detroit riots and was actually inspired by a police brutality incident that the composer of the song witnessed firsthand. It was the #1 soul single for 5 weeks and #2 on the Hot Billboard 100. But of course, the issues that America was having at the time were not only racial, they were also within gender politics. Second wave feminism showed us for the first time that women in the mainstream were demanding equal pay, equal treatment, and just the opportunity to be seen as equal humans. Now, the neo-boomer generation worked hard for the right to be themselves, and when they felt that they achieved it, they celebrated with a sexual revolution and the disco movement, which is important because it shows that although this generation is scrappy and rebellious and works hard, they're also very fun-loving. Now, unfortunately for them, the disco movement had quite a hangover. A lot of terrible things happened in the late 70s and the early 80s, the war on drugs, the AIDS crisis, but we also got Reagan. And Reagan's message of government not being the solution to the problem, but the problem itself, resonated with this generation that was already inherently mistrustful. And so they became a lot more self-preserving, something that's still true to them to this day. The neo-boomer, aside from being self-preserving, is also highly restless and will always be rebellious. But what they're rebelling against today is no longer the man, they're rebelling against what it means to age. 65% of younger boomers plan to work beyond the age of 65. 78% of younger boomers own a smartphone. I didn't find that one so surprising, but what really shocked me is that almost half of them own a gaming console. This generation is not who we think they are. And so the perfect insight for them is redefined age. Redefined Age is an insight on Trend Hunter that has over 70,000 clicks towards products and services and spaces that are often created by boomers for boomers to get together and redefine what it means to become older. One great example is a campaign by Sun Life Insurance called Welcome to Life After 50. The video within the campaign shows a bunch of people in their late 50s and their 60s doing fun things. So we see older women flirting with younger men. We see astronauts in their 60s. We see retirees on vacations that don't just encompass them sitting on the deck of a cruise liner drinking a drink. No, they're having fun and they're living life to their fullest. Which speaks to the idea that the neo-boomer is rebellious, looking to preserve a sense of self, and ultimately fairly restless and fun-loving. So that wraps up our module on the boomer generation. Some key takeaways to consider. The leading boomer wants to live well, but also do good. Consider social good when looking to target that older boomer demographic. As for our neo-boomer, they want to redefine what it means to age. So remember, they're invested in preserving a sense of self and being able to age while just remaining the people they've always been. Now for some questions to consider when applying this to your business. How could you help the leading boomer maintain a sense of adventure? And how can you help neo-boomers rebel against that boomer stereotype?